What's the most you've walked into? Story 1. I used to work as a security guard and got some patrol shifts one weekend to secure several secondary schools and elementary schools nearby, since school vandalism is very common on weekends between prom and graduation. While patrolling through an elementary school yard at around dusk, which was about 8 o'clock in the evening, I came upon a boy and a girl at the swing set in a very inappropriate situation for that place. I used my most authoritative voice to say, "This is not a good place to be doing that." The boy immediately started crying uncontrollably, and the girl panicked and ran away, leaving him behind. He would not stop crying, completely overwhelmed. I spent a long time calming him down before escorting him off school property. I never called the police or filed a report, figuring that the emotional impact of that moment would probably be enough of a deterrent. Story 2. I was delivering a parcel to a business in a remote location, walked in and found a very strange scene with a young woman and an elderly man. She paused and told me to wait, then came over and signed for the delivery before going back to gather what was on the floor while the man shouted a thank you. There must have been about 30 cucumbers scattered around. Later that same day, I delivered a parcel to another man who was in the middle of being arrested. The police allowed him to sign, and he made a provocative remark about the package, to which one of the officers replied sharply that he should keep quiet. It was a bizarre day, and I still look back with amusement at that first encounter with the old man. Story 3. I was the spot kid at a car dealership when I was 18. My job was moving cars around the lot, and whenever there was a spot, which was the term for when a salesman sold a car, I would clean it. I also cleaned up trade-ins and other vehicles when I could. We had taken in a huge conversion van as a trade, and I kept putting off cleaning it since it would take hours. Finally, one slow night, I grabbed the keys and headed to the back of the lot. When I opened the door, I unexpectedly found two of the male salesmen in a compromising situation on the pull-out bed, while the female sales manager watched from a swivel chair. There were also drugs involved. I shut the door quietly and walked away, never cleaning that van. Later, the service manager asked why I had not done it yet, and I told him that the sales manager had said I did not have to, so he should ask her. A few days later, the van was loaded and sent to auction, and nothing more was said. The sales office felt awkward for a while when I was around, but then the events of September 11th happened, and everything else was forgotten. Story 4. In the late 1990s, there was an after-hours bar I used to go to in Philadelphia. Since I was bartending at the time, it was a good place to grab a drink after work. It was run by the mob, and you pretty much had to know someone to be allowed in. Until midnight, it was a lesbian bar. Then they would close and reopen at 2 o'clock in the morning. One night I got out of work early and decided to go over there at around 1 o'clock. The bouncer knew my uncle well, so when I walked up, he let me in, even though they were not officially open. I went upstairs, turned the corner, and saw the bartender behind the bar, and on the other side, a man chained to a chair. Two mob guys I recognized were beating him badly, and there was blood all over him. They were not asking questions, just hitting him. The bartender looked at me and asked if I wanted a drink. I said, "No, you know what? I will come back after you open." And I turned right around and walked back downstairs like Grandpa Simpson in that famous scene. When I left, I told the bouncer he might not want to let anyone else in early that night, and then I left. Story 5. This happened to someone I know in a different hospital. The hospital had a relatively small intensive care unit with a total of somewhere between 6 and 10 beds. A patient was admitted for an out-of-control infection that developed after he went swimming in a lake about a week after discharge from a previous hospital admission when he had managed to catch his clothes on fire. He had severe burns covering his entire lower body, from his ankles to his waist, including very sensitive areas. Swimming in unclean water after something like that is a recipe for disaster. He was diagnosed with necrotizing fasciitis and had recently undergone a surgical debridement of his lower body, and the nurses and patients nearby in the intensive care unit were constantly complaining about the strong odor coming from his room due to the infected skin. He was a pleasant man caught in a very bad situation, but he had an extremely loud and disruptive girlfriend who was constantly harassing the medical staff. My friend, a physical therapist assistant, walked into the patient's room to get him moving for the day and was not really paying attention to the sounds behind the curtain. He pulled it back and was shocked to see the girlfriend in a very inappropriate situation with the patient. And in the process, they had removed all of his medical dressings, which were heavily saturated with drainage and hanging off the bed. My friend said the smell hit him first, but what he saw stayed in his memory forever. From what he recalled, the patient passed away about a week later from complications of infection, and my friend says he still pictures that scene every time he gets a patient in that same room in the intensive care unit. Story 6. Not me, but a friend. We both worked in a fairly upscale hotel. He worked in maintenance and got a call to fix a broken door latch. As he approached the room, a very upset teenage girl stormed out, yelling at her parents that she was not watching this again. The girl let my friend into the room, and then things got very strange. The girl's parents were extremely overweight and lying under the covers in bed, which at first did not seem unusual. They instructed my friend to begin the repair, but as he gathered his tools, the parents unexpectedly behaved in a way that left him deeply uncomfortable. Instead of allowing him space, they insisted he continue working despite the inappropriate situation unfolding right in front of him. Shaken, he tried to finish quickly, struggling to focus on the latch he had been called to fix. As he left, one final strange image stuck in his mind. The father casually holding a glass of chocolate milk, while everything else continued around him. My friend admits he has never forgotten that disturbing and surreal day. Story 7. This summer, I was leaving work in a rural area in New York. I got to the main highway, let a motorcycle pass, turned, and started down the road behind him. He was going fast. Anyone who lives in rural New York can probably guess where this is going. I saw a deer running across a field ahead of us. Surely the man on the motorcycle saw the deer. Hopefully the deer heard the motorcycle, but no. The deer ran into the road, the man lost control, and the deer miraculously jumped over the skidding bike and ran off. I stopped my car, ran to the man while dialing 911. There was a thin layer of what had once been part of his foot spread out over the road. He was screaming for me to get the bike off him. Other drivers stopped, and together we pulled the bike off, while I was still trying to reach emergency services. His hand was badly injured, and his foot was pinned under the motorcycle. His shoe had come off, and his foot was damaged down to the bone. He took off his helmet, and we realized he was probably close to 80 years old. He was chewing on a toothpick, which had gone through his lip in the crash. We tied a belt around his leg to stop the bleeding. The ambulance arrived, and they took him away. I never found out what happened to him afterward. He had been wearing jeans, a leather jacket, no gloves, and loafers. The dark skid mark left behind by his foot remained visible on the road for several days until rain finally washed it away. Story 8. I was backpacking through Europe with 3 friends years ago, and this happened in Amsterdam. One of our friends had gotten sick during the trip and had missed a lot of our time in Prague and all of our time in Berlin, which was roughly 10 days. In Amsterdam, he finally felt better and decided to join us on one of those tourist pub crawls on his very first night out since being ill. Long story short, he got absolutely drunk and was all over the place. When we moved on to a different bar with the group, we looked around and could not find him anymore at around 10 o'clock in the evening. We assumed he had either gone home or would meet up with us, but since we were drunk too, we just assumed the best. By 4 o'clock in the morning, we were walking back to our hostel without any sign of him, hoping he was back and asleep. When we opened the door, we found him in the fetal position in his boxers on the floor of the room. What started as a sigh of relief quickly turned into horror and disgust, as we noticed he, along with the entire room, was covered in filth. It was smeared on the beds, on the walls, on him, on his back, and on his hands. There was also vomit spread throughout the bathroom. The strangest part was that his clothes had been neatly folded at the end of his bed. He had no memory of what had happened that night. Even 10 years later, I can still picture and smell that room. Story 9. A few years ago, right after my husband and I got married, we went to his family reunion. My husband is originally from Kenya, and the reunion was at his parents' house in Nairobi. I had only ever met his parents before, so I was very nervous to meet the rest of the family because I wanted to make a good impression. His parents have a pretty large house, so some of the family members who came from out of town were staying there too, us included. The first night, I could not really sleep because of the time zone difference, so I got up at about 4 o'clock in the morning to get a glass of water. I heard something in the living room but thought nothing of it since my husband had mentioned his mom has insomnia and is often awake at odd hours. I figured I would get water and maybe talk to her for a bit before going back to bed. When I walked into the living room expecting to see my mother-in-law, I instead saw his uncle on the couch with his wife in a very intimate situation. I panicked and froze, and so did they. They did not speak English, and I could barely speak Swahili at the time, so we could not communicate at all. I just turned around and went back upstairs. I never mentioned it again, but to this day, seeing them at holidays is still very awkward. Storyten. I was drunk at a party in a bar with two of my roommates. The line for the bathroom was massive, so I decided to go outside and relieve myself against a stone wall across the street. There I met a man who had been kicked out of the party. He asked if I wanted to use a normal bathroom. I said yes and followed him to his place just around the corner, above my usual coffee shop in the Netherlands. I went upstairs and used his bathroom, but when I walked out, he was standing there holding a large kitchen knife and said, "How about I stab you right now?" Being drunk and not fully processing, I replied, "I'd rather you did not." He put the knife down, and I followed him to the living room where there was a piano. He asked if I played, and still nervous from the knife, I mumbled yes, even though I really could not. He told me to play, and as he threatened me again with the knife, I tapped a few random keys. Then he rolled a joint, asked if I wanted some, and I sat down with him on the couch. My friend called and asked where I was, and I explained I was above the coffee shop. My friend came over, rang the bell, and also got threatened before joining us on the couch to smoke. We got high, eventually left, and I never saw that man again. Story 11. When I was a child, my father was absent from my life for a time. At his house, he apparently used to throw wild parties, and one of them I later heard about went like this. My father was hosting a massive party in the middle of nowhere, back in 2005. He worked in the adult entertainment industry, so he had many of his friends from that business over, including some well-known names. There were people using substances, drinking, and everything you might imagine at such a party. At some point, one man, let us call him Bruiser, suggested they should order pizza and mess with the delivery guy. They chose a man named R, about 30 years old, military build, bad teeth, deep voice but very funny, and decided to dress him up as a woman using costumes. My father described it as two beautiful women helping put him into a dress and wig. R was completely transformed, with makeup, heels, and everything. The pizza delivery arrived, and R went to answer the door in his disguise. The delivery guy was a college student, and R, in character, invited him to join the party. To everyone's surprise, the pizza guy agreed. Later, people found that R had taken the delivery guy into a separate room, and the situation had escalated into something very intimate between them. Everyone else, already drunk and high, laughed and cheered it on. Eventually, they gave the delivery guy a very large tip, along with some extras, and sent him on his way. To me, hearing about it years later, it sounded like a complete nightmare. Story 12. For a long time, I worked as a security guard. I worked for a company that was contracted by a very wealthy man who had a serious problem with skaters and homeless people being anywhere near his property. His property was in an area with a large homeless population, but he did not even want people on the sidewalks, and he had enough influence with the city that he was able to enforce that, even though the sidewalks were public. The police supported him in this. Most of my interactions ended up being with homeless people. One day I got a call about someone going through the trash. I went to check it out, and the man actually seemed fairly put together and did not look like he had been homeless for long. He tried to bond with me, but while I did not want to dehumanize him, I also had a job to do and needed to keep some distance. Over time, I kept running into him, and we built a kind of understanding. We both knew what the other had to do, and neither of us was hostile. We ended up joking and laughing whenever we saw each other. Then one day I saw him completely out of his mind, drunk and possibly on drugs. He had mentioned earlier he had a toothache, and that day he had pulled his front teeth out with pliers. He was drenched in blood, and I knew things were getting out of control. About a week later, I was on an overnight shift and got a call to respond to one of our buildings. They would not tell me what was happening, just that the problem was downstairs in the fitness center. I went in, turned on the lights, and there was the same man on a bench with another homeless man in a very compromising situation. The moment the lights came on, they panicked, and one of them jumped up, crashed through a glass door and ran off, leaving blood everywhere. That was the last time I ever saw him. I quit that job shortly after. Story 13. I was working as a Zamboni driver and custodian at a decent-sized arena, but I wore many hats. One summer weekend, the entire facility was rented out for a club team hockey tournament, which was great for business since summer was usually slow. If you have never been to an event like this, here is how it goes. About 200 players, along with wives, children, and spectators, arrive on Friday. Games start Friday night and run through Sunday afternoon. Event staff has about 15 minutes between games to resurface the ice and clean locker rooms, which means things slowly deteriorate over the weekend since we can only do quick tasks like emptying trash and mopping up spills. The most important thing to know about hockey players is that they drink heavily. If they are not on the ice, they are outside in the parking lot tailgating. I could not believe how they managed to play while being drunk for 3 days straight. By Sunday evening, I was mentally preparing for a long night of deep cleaning locker rooms that had not been properly maintained. I walked into the first locker room and was immediately hit by an overpowering smell. In the showers, someone had smeared what looked like 3 days of drinking and fast food in a grotesque mess all over the wall, the grout, and even into the drains. It was the closest I had ever come to saying, "I do not get paid enough for this." Unfortunately, the only other employee in the building at the time was my manager, who was 6 months pregnant, so I had to clean it myself. I finished the night by throwing away my shoes and socks and going home and borrowed gym shorts because the ones I had been wearing were ruined. Story 14. This situation walked right into me. I used to manage a gas station. It was small inside with not much space. One older lady came in to buy a soda or something, and as she came up to pay, another woman entered the store in a rush, clearly upset. She stormed around until her boyfriend, or maybe her husband, came in and the two of them started screaming at each other loudly. The poor elderly woman was at the counter looking at me with the most terrified expression. After being shocked by the couple yelling such harsh words at each other, she quickly paid and ran out. The two continued shouting, and I tried to calm them down once the store was empty except for them, but it did not work. The woman picked up a glass commemorative mug we were selling and swung at the man's head but missed. She was seriously aiming at him. To his credit, he mostly kept his composure and did not retaliate. I ran back to the counter to call the police while the shouting continued. On the phone with emergency services, I could hear them yelling in the background. Eventually, she swung again and hit him on the side of the head. The mug shattered and he fell to the floor. She looked stunned, dropped the handle, and walked out to sit in their car. Surprisingly, he was not bleeding and began to recover while lying there, saying little. The police finally arrived, questioned them, and took them away. I was left cleaning up broken glass and candy boxes, though luckily no blood. The next day their car was gone from the parking lot, so one of them must have been released. I never did find out what they were fighting about or how it ended. Story 15. I was stationed in Hawaii and went to pick up some jungle boots I had dropped off to be resold. I went into the shop and the man working there told me they were in the back, so I followed him through rows of shelves and boots scattered on the floor. He eventually found mine, but they had not been started yet. He said he could fix them while I waited, and I agreed. He offered me a beer, and even though it was about 10 o'clock in the morning, I accepted. While working on the boots, he began telling me about how his wife had left him, how much he missed his kids, and that he was living in his shop now. I tried to be polite, but kept steering the conversation back to the boots because his talking slowed him down whenever he stopped to make eye contact. He eventually got the new soles on, but said the glue needed time to dry. Then he went further back into the shop and returned with a soda can and a lighter, asking me if I used substances and if I wanted to try. I told him the beer was more than enough for me. I stayed calm since I just wanted my boots finished, and by then I had been there about an hour and was on my third beer. He went ahead and smoked while chatting with me casually, as if it was normal. I could not believe what I was watching. It felt like being in a documentary. Here was a middle-aged Asian American father and business owner using drugs in his own shop as casually as someone might smoke a cigarette. Eventually, he told me the boots were ready, and I left. I never had another pair resold after that, but honestly, I might have gone back simply because the whole experience was so strange. Story 16. I was in the Army for a long time. And we had this duty called staff duty, where you stay awake for 24 hours and make sure nothing gets out of control. I was bored at the desk, so I took the van they let us use and drove down to the barracks to do some checks. I walked around looking for drunk soldiers passed out or anything unusual. Then I heard what sounded like someone getting hurt in a small utility room. I opened the door and discovered two of my male soldiers in a very intimate situation, right there among mop buckets and shelves of cleaning supplies. They both worked directly with me every day. I stepped back out, gathered myself, and told them through the door to meet me outside once they were ready. They came out embarrassed and worried I would report them, which could have caused them serious trouble. The military's more accepting now, but at that time, just after the repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act, it was not an easy place to be openly gay, especially in our type of unit. I never told anyone, but made sure they knew they were reckless for choosing to hide in a literal closet while still struggling with the figurative one. Story 17. I worked at a fast food place when I was in my teens. Everyone called out of work one night, so I had to call the store owner, who was extremely cheap, to come help. It ended up just being me and him doing the work of 4 people. In reality, I did the work of 3 while he only took orders up front. During the dinner rush, the drive-thru ran out of straws, so I went to grab a new box from the top shelf in storage. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something fall from the top of the stack, but I was in a rush and ignored it. I opened the box and dozens of cockroaches poured out and then ran back inside. I yelled for my boss to come look, but he shouted that he was busy and to just tell him. I insisted until he came back, and when I thumped the box again, the roaches scattered out. He asked if all the boxes were like that, so I tapped the stack with a broom handle, and more cockroaches came pouring out onto the floor. He then told me to check if there were any straws up front, but there were only 3 left. When I came back, he was shaking straws out into the trash can, trying to get the cockroaches out so he could still use them, even though the wrappers were clearly soiled. He looked at me and said, "They have wrappers, they are still good." I walked out right then in the middle of the rush. I assume he had to close since he did not know how anything worked. When I came in the next morning, everything was cleaned, and he had stocked up with new straws from a supermarket, bright, multicolored, bendy straws. For some reason, he even gave me a raise. He cut corners constantly, but this was by far the worst. Years later, I saw him at an electronics store trying to negotiate the price of a brand new console. I sincerely hope he is still miserable. Story 18. One day at work, I got a call to repair or replace a hospital bed that was malfunctioning at a nursing home. Most of these facilities have a locked wing for residents with memory conditions. After speaking with the receptionist, she led me into the memory care wing. Immediately, I was hit with a strong smell of waste. The building was shaped like the letter T, and as I walked down the first hall, the odor became stronger. I turned left and went down a long, dead-end hallway toward the room I needed, and the smell grew worse with every step. The door was ajar, and it was clearly the source. After bracing myself, I knocked and entered. Inside was the bed I was there to fix, with a man sleeping in it, completely covered in his own excrement. He was wearing nothing but an overflowing diaper that was leaking. The mess was all over his legs, back, stomach, and arms. I was horrified. Fortunately, the bed problem was easy to fix. It only took a few seconds to reattach a part that had fallen off the footboard. I nearly got sick again as I left the room. I rushed down the hall to the nurse's office and told her what I had walked into and that she needed to attend to it immediately. She signed the order for the repair, and I left as quickly as possible, trying to forget what I had just seen. Story 19. It was my 3rd day working as an electrician on a construction site that was being built into a clothing store in Walnut Creek, California. I always arrived at least 30 minutes early because I was paranoid about being late and getting fired. While waiting for the crew, my stomach started rumbling badly from the large coffee I had drunk. I hurried to the portable restrooms, which I knew had been cleaned the day before, figuring it would be fine. Since it was around 5:30 in the morning and still dark, I did not check the seat. I sat down and immediately realized something was wrong. I turned on the light on my hard hat and saw that the restroom was covered in filth. It was on me, all over the seat, and the smell was unbearable. I started gagging but could not stop because I desperately needed to go. I reached for toilet paper only to find it also smeared. Now my hand was covered too. I left the stall with my pants still down, moved into the next portable toilet, and thankfully it was clean. I spent nearly an hour trying to wipe everything off. By the time I got to work, I was late. My foreman glared at me, so I explained what had happened. He shook his head, laughed, and told me he would count me for a full day's pay and to just go home. Story 20. I will never forget this, not just for what happened, but for my wife's reaction. This was about 11 years ago. Backstory: my wife and I lived in a condo at the time, and during the day a neighbor I did not really know was walking around looking for her missing cat. She pointed to the next set of buildings and said she lived in those units, and since they all looked alike, we told her politely that we would keep an eye out. A few hours later, once it was dark and the streetlights were on, we spotted the cat but could not figure out which unit it belonged to. My wife told me to just go knock on each of the 5 doors to find her. I went to the first door and noticed it was cracked open about an inch, with the lights on, so I knocked anyway. A friendly female voice replied, "Hello." Confused, I knocked again and got another playful, "Hello." Thinking she was implying I should open the door, I pushed it slightly. Inside was our petite blonde neighbor, completely unclothed and waiting in a recliner for someone who clearly was not me. I quickly shut the door as I heard her scrambling around to cover herself, apologizing through the door, and explaining that I thought she was the one missing the cat. She firmly said no, and I apologized again before heading home, deciding not to knock on the other doors. When I walked back, my wife was surprised at how quickly I returned. She began asking if I had found the cat's owner, but stopped when she saw the shocked look on my face. She asked what was wrong, then guessed, "You look like you just saw someone naked." I was stunned and asked how she knew, and when I told her the story, we both laughed until we cried. To this day, we still laugh about it whenever we remember that neighbor. Story 21. I have 3. The first one. I used to get calls to my grandpa's house all the time while he was alive to fix random things, like the sump pump in the basement or something in the upstairs loft. One day he called me saying his television was not working. Usually it was something simple, and sure enough, he had just set it to the wrong input. I pressed the button, and suddenly the screen filled with very explicit adult content at full volume. Grandpa was completely unfazed, simply thanking me for fixing it, while I joked that blasting the sound like that could blow his speakers. The second, my friends and I once witnessed a terrible car accident. A man was driving recklessly, drifting around a corner at high speed, when he hit a boulder, went airborne, and crashed upside down into the side of a building. We and several other drivers rushed to help. We tried to pry open the door or move the car, but even with about a dozen people, it was wedged in too tightly. We spoke to the driver, who could only reach out a hand, but the rest of him was trapped. It felt like forever before the fire department and police arrived, and when they did, they waited for someone to shut off power and gas to the building before acting. I was furious, yelling at them that a man was inside, and nearly got arrested. Sadly, he died inside the car before anything was done. The third, I was at a party with a lot of friends and everyone was heavily intoxicated. As people were leaving, I went to find the friend who had driven us there. I found him upstairs in a dark room, with his pants down, trying to be intimate with a girl. At first I laughed and started to joke that I would give him time, but then I realized the girl was unconscious, completely passed out. I immediately pulled him away and told him we were leaving. 2 days later, the girl's friend called me asking if I knew him, and I said yes, bracing myself to tell the police what I had seen if needed. Instead, she just asked for his number and address. They never reported it, and somehow she and my friend stayed in contact, but I stopped hanging out with him from that night forward. Story 22. The apartment above us was on fire. When it comes to fight or flight, I always thought I would run, but maybe not. It was a large Victorian house split into 3 units, and I lived in the basement. The man above me had draped clothes over a chair that got pushed against a radiator. He left for work, and evidently, it ignited. As I was getting ready for my own job, the top-floor neighbor banged on my door, yelling that the place was on fire. He was known for being eccentric, so I stepped outside to see for myself. Sure enough, gray and black smoke was pouring from the middle of the building. He already had a fire extinguisher, so I ran back through my unit to grab another from the laundry room. We ran up to the middle unit, and I kicked the door in without thinking about safety. Immediately, we were hit by thick smoke and incredible heat, like the wave you get from opening an oven, only 100 times stronger. I briefly wondered if I still had eyebrows. As the smoke billowed out, I could see flames not far from the door. I pulled my shirt over my mouth and nose and sprayed the fire as I moved closer. My neighbor opened the front door to release smoke and then helped me put out the burning chair, walls, and cabinets. Just as our extinguishers emptied, we heard the fire trucks pulling up. The firefighters finished the job, putting out a few hot spots. They said the fire had nearly reached a gas line that could have blown up the whole building. The landlord was grateful and gave me free rent for the next month. Story 23. I work in a casino as a security guard. One night, a high roller wanted an escort to his room, so a female officer friend of mine and I accompanied him. He was about 65 years old. As soon as he opened his room door, he began urinating on himself while shaking our hands and thanking us. The puddle spread across the tile like someone had poured out a 2-liter bottle. My friend went to get towels and call housekeeping while I stayed behind so no one would slip in it. As I waited, I heard him yelling inside the room. It became clear he was being physically aggressive toward his wife while calling her names. I alerted my friend on the radio, and we both rushed to the door. Before we could knock, the man suddenly opened it, completely unclothed. He told us bluntly to leave because he was busy. I asked if he was hurting his wife, and he said she enjoyed it. Then his wife came to the door and explained this was how they like to behave, saying it was creative for their age. My friend and I were speechless and chose not to discuss the incident for days afterward. Story 24. When I was in college, a friend told me he met someone who lived a block off campus and sold marijuana. We decided to meet him. He looked like a normal guy in his early 20s and even worked at the sandwich shop on campus. We followed him to his house, and when he opened the door, we walked into a strange scene. About 15 people of all ages, from children to elderly, dressed in old-fashioned clothing like something out of a 1970s television show. They were sitting around watching television. The dealer ignored them and told us to follow him to his bedroom, which was right next to the living room. Inside were about 5 teenagers, dressed like ravers, partying, drinking, and using drugs in a scene that looked straight out of a movie. It was like a mini rave happening on a Tuesday afternoon, while on the other side of the wall, the rest of the household sat watching Jeopardy in silence. I remember a small girl dressed like a comic book character, bouncing on the bed with balloons tied to her waist. We bought what we came for, walked past the strange group in the living room, and left. To this day, I still have no idea what was really happening in that house. Story 25. When I was a kid, my mom dated bikers. I remember when I was about 12 years old, we were living with one of her boyfriends. He seemed like a good guy but had issues. One night, around 4 in the morning, I woke up thirsty and went to the kitchen for water. He was sitting in the living room with his face covered in blood. He smiled and said, "The best thing about hitting yourself is that once you knock yourself out, you cannot do any more damage." Then he began punching himself until he fell unconscious. I did not know what to do, so I covered him with a blanket, got my water, and went back to bed. The next day I told my mom, and she said she already knew he did that sometimes. Months later, they had an argument in the driveway, and I saw him grab her by the arm. Without thinking, I ran to grab a baseball bat. But by the time I got back outside, she had already defended herself, stomping him and shouting at him never to touch her again. I had to calm her down because she looked ready to go too far. That was the last night we stayed with him. Story 26. When I was in college, a buddy and I went from Michigan to Toronto to meet some girls and then head to a party. I was pretty straight-laced but open to new experiences. After meeting up, the girls convinced us to go to a rave. They wanted to buy something, so we ended up driving them to their dealer's place. They said he was cool and laid back, so we figured it would be fine. We pulled up to a typical college apartment, and a normal-looking student greeted us. Once inside, it felt like stepping into a scene from a movie. There were bags of pills stacked on the table, bricks of marijuana, bags of mushrooms, packages of white powder, and a small cash box stuffed with counterfeit bills. It had to be hundreds of thousands of dollars in product. Yet there was no security, no dogs, no guards, nothing. The dealer seemed like any other college kid. He casually gave the girls what they wanted, offered us extras, even tried to sell me counterfeit bills, then sat back on the couch making small talk until we left. On the drive away, my buddy and I both asked the girls what on earth that was. Turns out one of them had an arrangement with him in exchange for free drugs. He was tied in with organized crime and moving large amounts through the rave scene. A year later, my buddy was working with him, moving shipments into the United States. Another year after that, the guy was in prison on conspiracy charges. Rumor was that a witness against him died under suspicious circumstances, likely arranged by the criminal network. It was an eye-opening start to understanding just how deep that world went. Story 27. Working as a paramedic, I walked in on a lot of chaotic scenes, but this one stands out. My partner and I were called to an overdose in a very rough part of town, the type of place where emergency crews always had sheriff escorts. We entered a small apartment with 2 deputies and found 5 people collapsed around the living room. 2 were in full cardiac arrest, including a large woman sprawled on top of a man. Rolling her aside, we discovered they were both unresponsive. Another man on the floor still had a weak pulse but was barely breathing. Classic signs of an opioid overdose. My partner found another woman on the couch, also alive but struggling. In the corner, a man slumped with a belt around his arm, and a needle beside him stirred when I roused him. He admitted he had used Hero and asked for help. I placed him on oxygen while focusing on the others. We had only 2 oxygen tanks, so I requested more from the fire department as they approached. I began administering naloxone intramuscularly, first to the man on the floor, then to the woman on the couch, and finally a smaller dose to the man in the corner. One of the deputies helped to ventilate a patient, while my partner managed another. Slowly, people began reviving. The man on the floor vomited as he woke up. The woman on the couch eventually responded after multiple doses in an IV, and the man in the corner became alert. The fire crew arrived and we divided responsibilities. They worked on the 2 in cardiac arrest while my partner and I stabilized the living patients. Despite advanced interventions including airway support, intravenous medications, and repeated resuscitation efforts, both patients in full arrest did not survive after prolonged CPR. The others were stabilized and transported, and the deputies helped us clean up equipment before the medical examiner arrived. Looking back, I know there were things I could have done better, but ultimately the outcome likely would not have changed for the 2 who had arrested before we arrived. Based on what we observed, it seemed they had all injected a tainted batch of Hero, likely cut with fentanyl. The man in the corner who made the emergency call probably saved the rest. Without him, all 5 might have died. Story 28. During a time in my life when I was very close with my girlfriend, our relationship had reached a level of comfort where visiting each other's homes felt completely natural. I never imagined that very familiarity would turn against me in such a painful way. One day she had left a sweater at my place, and I decided to return it. Since her parents weren't home, I assumed she was also away, especially because she had mentioned being out with family. I figured I'd just drop it off since her brother was around. When I reached her room, I heard something unusual from behind the door. Out of instinct, I opened it, only to be met with a sight that crushed me instantly. In that single moment, everything I believed about our relationship fell apart. She looked up at me, and it was the strangest, most painful moment. I placed her sweater down and left immediately. She ran after me trying to explain, but I was so overwhelmed with emotion that I almost fainted once I got outside. We had been together for nearly all of high school, and she had never shown any signs of unhappiness or problems between us. So witnessing her betrayal with my own eyes was unbelievable. That was in 2016, and unfortunately, I have not been able to find another relationship since. I have met many great people and have mostly moved on, but deep down, I always carry the thought of how everything can change in an instant. Story 29. One night I was driving home late, around 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I had to make a right turn at an intersection, but there was a car in the lane, and the light had just turned, so I cut through the gas station on the corner. I passed under the lit overhang, and as I approached the outlet back to the street, I noticed a man in a red shirt and white shorts walking on a path that would intersect my car. He was not on the sidewalk, just cutting through a side part of the gas station in the middle of the night. Something about him seemed wrong, though I could not place why, so I slowed down, stopped, and got out to ask if he needed help. It was dark where he was, and while he answered incoherently that he was fine, I could tell something was very wrong. As he walked under the gas station canopy lights, I finally saw the truth. He was wearing a white shirt and white pants soaked entirely in blood, and his face had a massive tear running across it. The left side of his face was lifted from his skull, and he was missing his left eye. Still, he kept walking, repeating that he was fine. I told him firmly that he should sit down, gesturing toward the curb, but he ignored me and continued toward the street. I stayed close by, and when it became clear he was about to walk into traffic, I ran ahead to wave down cars. As he reached the street, a police car pulled up, and the officer finally convinced him to sit down on the median, where he broke down crying. Later, I learned he had crashed his truck, crossed a median, gone down an embankment, and hit a tree. He had walked nearly 1/10 of a mile before I encountered him. For weeks after, every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. I'd never looked into what happened to him because part of me could not believe anyone could survive those injuries, and I did not want confirmation otherwise. Story 30. I worked for the United States office of a Canadian company that had locations across Canada, from Vancouver to Toronto to Montreal. Each office had a director, and we held quarterly meetings that rotated between cities. These gatherings usually involved dinners, sporting events, and bars, so it was more social than anything. For this story, the meeting was in Montreal. The director there was known for liking adult clubs, and that night his favorite place was on the itinerary. It was about 45 minutes outside of town in a rough location. I was along for the ride, not much into that scene, but I went anyway. We arrived, checked in with the bouncers, and walked into what looked like a surreal Halloween-themed night. Staff were in costumes, lights flashed, and the interior looked like a chaotic version of a cabaret. We sat near the stage, ordered drinks, and watched the performers while music played and videos flashed on screens in the background. About half an hour in, the DJ announced a break. Suddenly, smoke poured from behind the stage curtain, lights spun, rock music blasted, and out marched a full band of little people dressed in complete Kiss makeup and costumes. They were 4-foot-tall versions of Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Ace Frehley, and Peter Criss, performing full-on Kiss covers with total energy. The scene was beyond anything I could have imagined. Rock music blasting, performers on stage, people around us partying, and this miniature version of Kiss playing as if it were Madison Square Garden. It was so bizarre and unforgettable that I still struggle to put into words how surreal it felt in that moment. Story 31. It is a toss-up between two experiences. When my parents divorced, we moved with my mother 2 states away, and she quickly became involved with the wrong man. I do not know if it was loneliness or the feeling she needed protection, but she ended up with someone dangerous. I was about 7 years old, my sister was younger, and my brother was a little older. One night we heard yelling and banging, so we ran into the room and found him on top of my mother with a knife to her throat, threatening her. My sister said something to him and my mother screamed for us to call the police, which we did. I do not even know if he went to jail that night because my mother probably downplayed it as just an argument. Years later, when I was 19, he was still living with us, and his behavior was still inappropriate. He and my sister did not get along, and for weeks I had a feeling something bad would happen. One day I heard another crash and found him on top of my sister, strangling her. I pulled him off, and we fought until I had him by the throat, but I held back from going too far. By the end, he walked away with a dislocated jaw and bleeding from near his throat. The worst part was when the police came to take statements. My mother told my crying sister that she deserved it. Story 32. I found my boyfriend, the father of my daughter, on the bathroom floor after he had overdosed. I had just gotten home and heard the water running, confused because he was supposed to have left for work. I found him kneeling on the floor, face down, unresponsive. I panicked and tried to revive him. But even though I had medication that could sometimes help in those cases, it was too late. What haunts me most was when I lifted him. His face was so slack and lifeless. My yelling shifted from begging him to wake up, to telling him he could not do this to me, to finally saying I loved him and holding him as I waited for help. His hands were ice cold. The police and ambulance arrived, and the emergency crew worked hard to revive him. And for a moment I hoped they could, but the officer eventually told me he had passed. It was the worst moment of my life. He had been my best friend for almost 10 years, and I had taken for granted that he would always be there. I fear I will never find another connection like that. It has been 8 months since, and it has completely wrecked me. Story 33. When I was younger, I worked as a bartender and saw a lot of wild things. We kept odd hours, sometimes staying up until 6 or even 10 in the morning drinking together. At one of our after-hours hangouts, a man from the neighborhood came over in a frenzy yelling at us about drinking while he was clearly struggling himself. My friend joked about him, which set him off, and he went home screaming and throwing things before calling the police. The officers checked on us, saw we were all of age, then left after making sure we would not provoke him. An hour later, a group of men in suits arrived and took him away, probably a recovery group or something similar. Another morning, a huge dog wandered up to us, but it turned out to be very friendly. We followed it back to its owner, who was passed out on a random lawn. We carried him home, where his roommate simply sighed and said, "Yeah, that sounds like Steve." I also remember a security guard who came by once, a veteran who was clearly struggling with trauma, and things escalated quickly until he had to leave. On other occasions, we had to stay inside because of nearby shootings. One of my friends even had to deliver thousands of dollars to a well-known performer's crew at night to ensure he showed up for an event. I saw countless bar fights, including one where a man was knocked out with a heavy vodka bottle, and many nights we ended up laughing at how reckless things had been. Looking back, most of it was far from safe, but at the time we were young, reckless, and thought we were untouchable. Story 34. I remember when I was between 7 and 10 years old. My dad worked in a construction brigade that handled everything from water piping to excavation to building foundations. One day he came home with a large pack of beer, more than usual, and while I ran into the living room, I overheard him speaking calmly to my mom in the kitchen. He said that a man had died at his work that day. He went into detail, explaining that it was a young man around 23 to 25 years old who was crushed by a block weighing close to a ton. The crane operator had not seen him, and the block came down on him. My father said he witnessed the entire thing and rushed over, but the man only gasped a few times before passing away. It was gruesome, and I was shocked just listening. My mom was horrified, but my dad remained steady and even called me over to tell me the same story. His message to me was clear: always be careful when working, especially around dangerous equipment or construction sites. From those stories, I learned that life can end instantly if you are not careful or if you lose focus while on the job. Story 35. I knew a guy named Kyle who had a kind, soft-spoken demeanor. His girlfriend was the same way. Nice and seemingly innocent. The type who did not laugh at crude jokes. We all lived in the same college dorm and often rotated which room we would hang out in. One night, a group of us were in Kyle's room watching a show. I had been drinking a little with a couple of friends, while Kyle and his girlfriend sat together on the couch looking like a couple in love. Eventually, the others excused themselves, leaving just me with Kyle and his girlfriend. I decided to head up to my room on the 7th floor, but realized too late that I had left my key behind in Kyle's room on the 2nd floor. Too drunk to think about knocking, I simply walked back in. And that is when I saw his girlfriend over his knee while he spanked her. Kyle looked at me, noticed my eyes fall to my keys on the floor, picked them up, and tossed them to me. Story 36. I worked in a cinema a few years ago, and during a Harry Potter release on a Saturday night, the staff were exhausted after the last shows had gone in. We suddenly heard commotion coming from one of the corridors as the film ended. A woman had vomited a huge amount of popcorn onto the carpet near the restroom, but that was not the worst part. She kept pointing toward the disabled restroom. We thought she wanted to go inside, so I opened the door and was hit with a nightmare sight. The restroom was completely covered in human waste from the toilet seat to the floor, walls, and even the mirror, with clothing items left behind. The rule at the cinema was that whoever spotted a mess had to clean it, but no one wanted to. The manager brought out straws and said whoever drew the shortest would do it. I was safe, but the new employee, unfamiliar with the system, ended up stuck with the task. The manager unfairly changed the rules to push it onto him. He worked there for years afterward, and whenever there was a similar mess, he never had to clean it again. Years later, I met him as my rideshare driver, and the first thing he said was how he finally understood what the short straw meant. We had a good laugh about it. Story 37. I got so sick with the flu that I nearly died on Christmas Day several years ago. At the hospital that morning, I saw a father with 4 teenage or young adult children arrive looking devastated. A nurse came out, and the family broke down crying. Their mother had attempted to take her life with a mix of pills and alcohol, and she was in a coma. The doctor later told them she was likely brain dead, and machines were only keeping her alive. More family arrived throughout the day, one by one being crushed by the news on what was supposed to be a holiday. Meanwhile, I had gone in thinking it was the worst day of my life because I had been violently ill for 3 days with fever, vomiting, and dehydration. When they admitted me, I was given fluids through IV lines in both arms and medication until I finally felt stable enough to go home. Seeing that family's tragedy unfold put my own suffering into perspective. Story 38. When I was working in animal control, I experienced the most disturbing home I had ever entered. On my day off, a colleague asked for help capturing 25 cats from an apartment. The man who lived there was a double amputee who moved around on his hands, and as we entered, I realized the floor was coated in a layer of filth and rotting carpet. The smell hit me like a wall, pure ammonia mixed with garbage and sewage. In the bedroom, cups filled with urine were scattered across the floor, and sick cats darted around them, spilling the contents as they ran. The worst moment came when I poked a decaying couch with my catch pole, and hundreds of insects poured out. By the end, we learned an elderly woman on oxygen lived there as well. During my time in animal control, I saw heartbreaking things. Animals hit by cars, severely injured dogs, even pets beside deceased owners. But the memory of that apartment, especially that couch, still haunts me. Story 39. I was working as a cocktail waitress at one of the only decent bars in a small college town when the drain behind the ice machine started to overflow. At first it did not smell, and it was not obvious what was happening, only that water was not draining properly. We assumed it was just a failure in the usual bar drainage system, where sink and ice water flowed. We had experienced drain issues before, and since the owner did not want to close during the summer off-season, when only regulars such as professors and lawyers came in, we tried to keep the bar running. Even 2 of the owner investors were there that night. Earlier, the owner of the building had stopped by with a date, saw the problem, had a drink, and left without concern. His lease made him responsible only for the roof and walls, leaving everything else to the bar. He had a reputation in town as a very eccentric man, and he owned a large portion of the local property. The bar layout included a path to a back garden with a side hall where the ice machine and equipment sat. That night I found myself ankle deep in water, wearing flats and a knee-length skirt, mopping with a bucket as the bartender continued to serve drinks. At first everyone thought it was just water, but we quickly realized it was sewage backing up from the old system in the building. The bartender said I looked like an angry version of Cinderella. An investor gave me a $50 tip, but looking back, it was not worth it. Story 40. This one I did not walk into so much as wake up to. About a month ago, my mom, my sister, and I were driving to school and work. The route included a secluded section of highway with many sharp curves and trees. That morning was very cold and we hit black ice, sending our car off the road and into a deep ditch among the trees. I struck my head during the crash and lost consciousness. When I woke up later, all I could see was broken glass and blood. Some of it mine, but most belonging to my twin sister. The car door had collapsed on me, pinning me down. My sister was in critical condition with a fractured skull and a traumatic brain injury, making awful noises that I can only describe as haunting. My mom had not woken up, and for a moment I believed she was gone. That week became the most terrifying of my life, and I would never want to experience anything like it again. Story 41. I will avoid going into details about what I saw in the Army, but a few years after I got out, I was sitting at work, bored, and decided to take the rest of the day off after lunch. The drive home was semi-rural, mostly a straight shot up the highway for about 15 minutes with a gas station, a couple of liquor stores, and a few motels along the way. Halfway home, there was a liquor store and motel on one side of the road, and a barber shop with a small club building on the other side. A man had apparently come out of the liquor store and was waiting in the median to cross. It was around 12:30 in the afternoon, and traffic was light. A young woman in a white Toyota sped past me in the fast lane, probably going 70 miles per hour while I was doing 60, when suddenly the man decided to cross and walk directly into her path. I saw his leg get hit, and when his shoe came off, the leg landed on my hood and stayed there as I braked. I ran toward the Toyota, and he had been thrown through the windshield, ending up crumpled in the seats, gravely injured. The young driver, probably late teens or early 20s, was screaming nonstop. Within 5 minutes, paramedics and police arrived and took over. It was by far the worst thing I had witnessed since leaving the military, and it was a chilling reminder of how quickly life can go from ordinary to devastating. Story 42. As a former firefighter and medic, there was one apartment complex we responded to frequently after it had been taken over by the Federal Emergency Management Agency following Hurricane Katrina. One particular apartment was so unsanitary that we often had to insist the residents bring the patient outside rather than sending us in. On one of the last occasions, we were called there again, and when I stepped inside, I noticed dirty laundry near the entry. A pair of a young girl's underwear, around 10 to 12 years old, was leaning stiffly against the wall. When I moved past it, the fabric shifted, and I tapped it with my foot. Hundreds of tiny insects scattered up the walls. My lieutenant, who was further inside, immediately started yelling, and both he and the paramedics rushed out, nearly knocking me over. Looking back inside, I realized the entire apartment was infested with what we later learned were German cockroaches, and my team had been crunching across them without realizing. Sadly, this was not new. We had seen infestations there before, and many units in that complex were in the same condition. But management could not do much without going through government channels to shut it down temporarily for fumigation. To this day, I do not miss stepping foot in that place. Story 43. A while back, in a small town where I used to live, there was a cleaners and dry cleaning shop owned by the kindest couple, an older Asian husband and wife, probably in their mid to late 60s. The entire community loved them, and even the children were especially fond of them. One day I dropped off a shirt and suit to get cleaned. Since I lived around the corner and the lady knew me well, she often let me bring my clothes and pay her at the end of the week. A few days later, I pulled into the parking lot to pick up my things and saw the husband walking in with a large duffel bag. I waved, but he did not respond, and I thought maybe he had not seen me. About 5 minutes later, I heard shouting followed by a burst of gunfire. It only lasted a few seconds before one final loud shot rang out. Shaken, I got out of my car and approached the shop. Inside, I saw a heartbreaking scene. The wife was on the floor, the daughter nearby, both with visible injuries, and the husband was in a chair with what appeared to be a fatal wound. I ran out immediately as someone from a neighboring business was already calling for help. The police came to my home hours later after I was identified on the security footage, and though I was terrified I would be accused, they only questioned me and then let me go. I never learned the true reason behind what happened, but rumors suggested the father may have been upset about discovering that his daughter was in a same-sex relationship. Whether that played a role or not, I cannot say, but I will never forget what I witnessed that day. Story 44. I had just moved to another city and switched high schools. On my third day there, the guy I sat next to asked if I wanted to go to a small restaurant near the school for lunch. Since students were allowed to leave campus, I joined him and a few of his friends, and we had average meatballs at a rundown spot. After a while, I needed to use the restroom and asked where it was. One of the guys pointed down a hallway, so I went. There was only one stall and one urinal, and the urinal already looked clogged. I reached for the stall door and opened it, only to see a middle-aged man with gray hair sitting inside. Shocked, I immediately closed the door and decided to wait until I got back to school. Later that day, feeling full from lunch, I walked into my geometry class and froze. The teacher was the same man I had just seen in the restroom. Thankfully, he never recognized me or learned my name. To this day, I still occasionally see the same group of friends from that lunch, as one now attends my university and another works part-time at my job. Small world with awkward coincidences.